So the very first thing I wanted to highlight a bit on is to provide a bit of sharing in terms of this AL scoring system and also what's the implications when it comes to secondary school posting. Okay, so that's the first part that we will go through. And right now you will see, so as I've mentioned just now, right? So during our times, actually, when we look at it in terms of PSLE scores, our PSLE scores were actually graded as a T-score. That means you look at it as upon 300 marks, how many marks do you get, right? So do you get 250 versus 230 or 270, etc., right? And you will see from there, actually, under that system, there's a lot more variation in terms of the types of score or the number of scores that your child can score, right? So it could be like, between just 230 to 240, there's already 10 different combinations, right? But under the new system, right, which is what we call as the AL scoring system, you will see that there is a change, right? So there's a shift away from a T-score system towards the AL score, right? And how does the AL score system work? If I were to simplify it for you, you can see on the table on the left. Essentially, you can think of it this way, right? So each AL score is kind of like a score bucket in which you have a raw marks that map to that. So for example, let's take a certain subject, like for example, for mathematics, right? So for mathematics, let's say if upon 100, your child or yourself as a student, right? If you score 84 marks, that means you are in this AL score of 3, right? So you will get an AL score of 3 for mathematics because you fall within the category where your AL score is 3, right? But if you do really well, for example, if you get 90 and above, that's where you get a AL1, right? And for those of you actually, since you have gone through the P5 examinations, this may not be something that you should be unfamiliar with because actually at the school level, usually for the end of year P5 exams, that's also how they will mirror the scores, right? So to give you a sense essentially of your overall AL scores and essentially based on that, what does it mean for P6? And we'll be talking about that a bit later as well. What you have gotten, right, in terms of your P5 end of year scores is already a good stock take and a good way to think through, what are the action plan for you, right, as you go into P6, as you start to prepare for the examinations as well. Okay, so you can see here, right? So for example, somebody who does really well, like 90 and above, that will actually be an AL of 1, right? And you can see generally, the lower the AL score, the better the performance of the child, right? So that's how we look at it, okay? And what you can see here, essentially, if you look at this, under this system, what you have in terms of the AL score for each subject, we will then combine them together as a total tally based on the 4 subjects that you take, right? So English, mother tongue, mathematics, and science. You combine the AL score together, and that will be your overall AL score that you get, right? So for example, there are different combinations. So a student could possibly get an AL score of 8 or an AL score of 16, for example, right? And that AL score is then what they use to try to get entry into different secondary schools, okay? And each secondary school are going to have their own different cutoff points, right? And the cutoff points will determine the students who are eligible to enter the school, right? So for example, if a school has a cutoff point of say 10, right? If it say has a cutoff point of 10, then a student with a score, AL score of say 11 or 12, it will be quite difficult, if not quite impossible for a student to enter the school, right? So that's how we look at it. And what you can see here is essentially 2 things that happens, right? With the whole shift from a T-score system, that means upon 300 marks, to now this AL score system, you can actually see a few things, right? So number one, you can see essentially the number of scoring bands, right, has become lower, right? So in the past, you see there's a lot of combinations of outcomes that you can get for different students. But right now is a lot lower, right? So there's only these 29 possible AL scores that you get. And what that means also is that essentially it is harder to differentiate between different students. That means it's quite possible that there are going to be many students who have an AL score of say 12 or many students with an AL score of say 14, right? So many more students will have the same score, right? And in fact, it's also the case that more schools will also have similar cutoff points. So for example, you could have school A that has a cutoff point of say 12 and school B that also have a cutoff point of say 12, right? So in this case, you can see what happens is that in a sense that competition is greater because there are more students with the same score competing for the same schools as compared to the past where you can see the scores are more finely differentiated. For example, a student with 250 versus a student with 252. Whereas now you have two students, simply the score is just a AL 12, right? How do we look at the differentiation? So that's one implication that has come up when you look at this AL scoring system. And what it really means is that when it comes to the end of the year, right, when you actually have gotten your PSLE score and you are trying to go select your schools, right? The important thing to note here is your school choice matter, right? The school choices is not something that I will touch in too much detail today because there are quite a lot of things that we are covering. But one of the implication is that the school choices, the six choices that you have to make, becomes very critical and very important under this new system, right? Simply because there are going to be many more students with similar scores applying for the same schools, right? So the priority of the school order, the school choice orders and everything is going to become much more important, right? And that's something that you all have to bear in mind as well. Okay. And I think here there's a question from a parent as well, which is whether schools can change the minimum AL score before the PSLE. So maybe what I will do at this point is I'll take a chance just to show you all, how you all get that information, right? So just to point you all to the resource on that so that it's clear to you all. So you can see over here, right? If you look at this one here, right? If I just exit and show. Okay, so now you all should be able to see the what we call as the MOE SchoolFinder, right? Which is the website for MOE for you to look at your schools, right? And to determine the different kinds of schools that are available for secondary schools. A parent had a question, right? Which is, does the cutoff points of different schools change from time to time, right? So I suppose that's the question, right? So the minimum score of schools. So indeed, okay, one way I want to point you all to is from this website. Later, I'll put a link on the chat so that you all can look at that if you are not as familiar with that. But what you can see here is essentially, thanks. So Teacher Mavis has already posted there. You can see once you look at this MOE School Finder, for example, if I just click on, say, Anglican High School, you can actually see here under the PSLE score range, over here, the cutoff points, right, of the school last year. So they have not updated yet. So you can see it's still 2023. The 2024 posting exercise have finished just recently in the past year, right? So that's why they have not updated the score yet. It still reflects as 2023. But you can see essentially this was the cutoff point from 2 years ago in 2023. So what you can see from there is essentially for this, what it means is 12 points. What is 12 points? 12 points is essentially the point, the AL score of the very last student who managed to make it into the school, right? And that means, anybody else, let's say anybody else who got 13 or more, there was no chance that the person would have gotten it, right? So that's the way we look at it. And I think now the parents' query is, does this change from year to year, right? In terms of the cutoff point of the school. So certainly, right, the answer to that is a yes, right? There is a possibility that the cutoff point can change, right? Just a quick one. So how does the cutoff point gets determined? It essentially gets determined by demand and supply, right? So how many students want to go into the school, right? Versus essentially how many places and vacancies are available in the school, right? And the more competitive it is for the school, generally the lower this point is going to be, right? So depending on the competition for the places, this will change. Okay, but one thing I can share is that typically from year to year, it does not change that much. So usually if you look at it for schools wise, typically it's a plus minus 1 or 2 change, right? And for some schools, it more or less remains stable. Okay, but what you all can see very interestingly in the past year that has just passed, right? 2024, because it was the Dragon Year intake, there were some pretty interesting trends that came up. Because essentially, Dragon Year, you had a larger cohort of students trying to compete, right? And once you see a larger pockets of such students competing for certain schools, you can actually see quite big changes in terms of cutoff points. For example, some schools even had cutoff points of, between, say, 2 to 3. That means they can actually drop by 3 points. Which is more drastic because usually you won't see that happening, right? Usually at most you just see a plus minus 1. And in fact, for most schools, it will be around there, right? So that is the basis that we will look at, okay? So this is in response to the parents' question. And this side here, I must say that this part here is something that is not just applicable for parents is for students as well. And later I'll talk a bit about that because this is actually the place for students, right? Where you can see all the different schools and essentially the cutoff points of the schools, right? And I think there's another parent who raised a good question, right? Is there a consolidated one? So the answer to this is not on the MOE website. So in the recent years, right? So in the past, what MOE used to do when they look at these cutoff points is that they will have a consolidated booklet, right? Where they look at every school and they provide you with the cutoff points year by year, right? But right now, what they have done through the SchoolFinder is they have stopped that consolidated copy, but is decentralized. So that means you can see here, we have to look at it in terms of individual schools and also in terms of the score for 2023 and so on. So if you want to look at the past few years, there are resources available actually online that has actually compiled these together, right? But it's just not available on the MOE website itself, right? In terms of having that consolidated view. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so I think another question. So to keep this interactive, I will also look at the questions and take some of these questions live as well. So I think about any advice regarding the school selection. Okay, I'll talk very briefly about that because as I mentioned, there's several focus areas that we are looking at today. So I also want to give some bandwidth to the other parts. But in relation to this school selection one, I think that's always something that we have highlighted in the past that when you look at schools, one way to look at it is number one, using the school finder as a way to so-called cast your net wide. Because if you look at the school finder, you can actually see quite a lot of useful information in terms of the electives and programs available at the schools, the CCAs available, and so forth. Right. And one thing is if you look at it in terms of the schools itself, there's going to be several considerations. And one thing that we have always highlighted is a very practical one, which is simply in terms of residential location, right? So based on where you live, what are the schools that make sense sensibly, right, in terms of the distance to you, right? And one consideration is essentially, in terms of the travel distance, right? So that's one part. And the second part is also in terms of your own preference, right? Do you have certain leaning towards certain types of programs? For example, some students right now, in fact, in your mind, you may be thinking about, okay, I really do want to try for the IP program, right? For the integrated program. And if that is the case, then it's going to more significantly narrow the pool of schools that you have. And it also means that you have to get a much better outcome in terms of your AL score, right? To be able to go into those schools. So it's going to be a matter of that as well, right? So what is the kind of path do you want, right? Are you still prepared to go on more of a SEC or what we call as the O-level route? Or do you want to go more on the IP route, right? And for some people, even more specifically, I think for some of the parents here may be thinking, I want my child to go on international baccalaureate, right? So under the integrated program, there's also IB, International Baccalaureate. And if so, then there's even fewer schools that offer that. So I would say in terms of the consideration, it's also the types of programs that you are offering in the schools, residential location, and also the CCAs. So another thing that usually comes up is, maybe your child has a certain interest areas in terms of CCAs, but the CCAs is not going to be something that's offered in every school as well, right? So that is something that you see actually if you look at the MOE SchoolFinder itself, like for example, the Anglican page, you can actually already see that in terms of the details of what they offer. Plus, you also can go to the school website itself to find more information on that too. Okay, Ken? Yeah. So that is the first part I wanted to highlight. Okay, the next one I want to do is to go back to what I have talked about just now. I'll go to the second page, which just addresses what these parents are asking for, which is with regards to what posting groups mean, right? What posting groups mean. So if you look at it, right, just now, I think for those of you who are very sharp, when you saw the website, you all saw this thing called the posting group, right? So perhaps maybe I'll just toggle back to that so that you all can take a quick look. This one here, right? This is what you mean, right? So how come there's a posting group? And that's a very good question because it looks very alien, right? Especially to parents who have not had students who were PSLE. So what would be more familiar to you in the past would have been express, normal acad, normal technical, right? So this actually has replaced that. And the reason why that was so is because under the MOE system, with effect from 2024, there has been the full introduction of subject-based banding, right, in secondary schools. right? And with that, what it means is essentially right now, and it's a very big change actually from our time and the parents' time as well. There is no more express, normal acad, and normal technical in school, right? Instead, what happens is in place of those buckets where last time MOE used to put students in, there's now the flexibility for students to take a combination of subjects based on their own ability level, their own interest level as well. So what it means is if I give you a very simple example, right? In the past, it may be, okay, I'm a student in normal acad, right? So if I'm in normal acad, I go into secondary school, all the subjects I take will be normal acad level, correct? So that's how it works. I'm just in that bucket, so I will take that. But now it's not quite like that, right? So now what happens is if you go in, and you say, let's say you go in and actually, for some of your subjects you didn't do so well, but you demonstrated a strength in terms of, say, your languages. For example, your English, your mother tongue are really strong. So what that would mean is that when you go into secondary school, there could be the choice where essentially, say your mathematics and science, you will take it at the medium difficulty level, which is what they will call as the G2 level. Whereas for English and Chinese, you have the option to take it at a more challenging level, which is at the G3 level, or you can think of it as the express level. So you can see it's a bit of a difference, right? So right now, you can actually do a bit of a mix and match of subjects of different difficulty level based on your demonstrated ability, right? So you are no longer just put into a certain bucket, but you have this option available, right? So that is the whole context behind subject-based spending that I would share a bit about. Okay, and here you can see, essentially what you can see from this is what does it mean then, right? In terms of the posting group, right? So I'm going to just toggle back here, and you can see over here, essentially based on your PSLE score. So I've talked about that just now, right? So the AL scoring system, based on your four subjects, you will have different scores, right? Based on that, you will be eligible for different posting groups. So you can see for students who have scored between 4 to 20, you will be eligible for posting group 3. 23 and 24 is posting group 2, and 26 to 30 is posting group 1. Now, what does that mean, right? So just now you were asking, so what does it mean when we talk about posting group? Posting group essentially determines at the very start, right, when you enter into the secondary school, what is your initial subject levels that you will generally take. So you see here G3, G2, and G1, right? What does it mean? Broadly put, you can think of it as G3 will be the highest difficulty level subjects. For example, like, previously it will be the express level subject. You can think of it that way. So G3 maps to an express level, right? G2 maps to a normal acad level in terms of the difficulty. And G1 maps to a normal technical level, right? So that's how we look at it. So essentially, the posting group itself determines the combination or the type of subjects generally that you will take. So a student who entered a school via posting group 3, the subject level that he will take for most of his subjects will be at the G3 level. That means it will be at the express level. Whereas somebody who enters via posting group 2, most of their subjects will be at the G2 level. And those who enter via posting group 1 will be at the G1 level. So that's what the posting group does. The posting group determines the subjects that you will be taking. You see here, why do they say most? Why do they say most? The reason why they say most is, remember what I said about the mix and matching. So even from the get-go, once you enter into the school, MOE will look at it in terms of the consideration. That, for example, let's say if you enter via 2, right, posting group 2, right? So most of your subjects are going to be at the G2 level, okay? So that is that. But let's say you demonstrated a good ability in terms of certain subjects, for example, like English, right? And you get AL5 or above, right? There's actually the possibility that you can take English at the G3 level, So what it could look like is then Maths, Science, Chinese, G2, English, G3, right? So that could be what it looks like, okay? So that's what a posting group means. And another very important implication, guys, is that not every school is going to be offering all three posting groups, right? So some schools offer posting group 3 only, whereas there are some schools who offer 3, 2, and 1. So by virtue of that, the logic of it is that if your child or for you as a student yourself, if you didn't get into that eligibility, that means let's say you are not here, you are here, that means straight away some schools that only offer posting group 3, you cannot apply for those schools. So that's another uh, very important implication, right, from this. Okay, so that's what posting group means, and hopefully this is something that is useful for parents who are seeing this for the first time. Okay, and indeed, so even right now, so just to be clear to everybody, right, there is also no more O levels, right? So when you all enter into school, right, so you're all very familiar with the O level system. Uh, the name has changed, right? So it's no longer called the O levels, but at Sec 4, what has happened is that there has been a change in the name from the O levels to the SEC, right? SEC exams. What's the SEC exams? You can think of it as pretty much it's like the O level exams, but the outcome of it is a bit different. And why is that so? Because if you look at it again, last time we used to have normal acad, express, and normal technical exam. That's it, right? But now you see you have different students taking different subject combination, right? Different, some G2, some G3, some G1, and so on. So therefore, you can see, therefore, the national exams has to reflect that as well, right? And that's the whole purpose of this SEC exam, where essentially for your certificate next time, what you will see is that, for example, you will see for English, okay, they will indicate I took it at the G3 level, and my score for that was a A1. For mathematics, I took it at the G2 level, and that was a A2, right? So that is how you will be affected, right? In terms of the exams itself, the SEC exams will reflect the grade that you took it at plus your score. Okay, so that's the thing to highlight as well. And okay, another question is, I think with regards to the cutoff point, I think there was a question whether SEAB will set the papers harder this year to bring down the COP, since Dragon Babies did very well last year, that impacted the cutoff and caused them to be lower. So this one, I think, frankly, I don't think we will be able to predict the the difficulty level of the papers, right? So I think from year to year, there's always been considerations on that. And in fact, I would say, because if you look at it across different subjects, the way they set the papers, I don't think that there's a hard and fast rule to say that, okay, this year is difficult, this year is easy, this year is difficult, and so on, right? There is no pattern to that. And even when you look at it in terms of the determining the difficulty level of the papers, I think there's a lot more considerations that go into that beyond just the cutoff point, selection, and so on as well. So definitely, I think, like, what I would advise here is, I don't think there's a need for you to second guess whether it's going to be a difficult year or not. I think what's more important is, think of the things that we can control, because we cannot control the difficulty level of the paper, correct? But what we can control is how we prepare for the paper, right? And notwithstanding that some questions may be hard, as long as we are well prepared, we will still be okay, right? So always focus on the things that we can control in terms of the outcome. Because, for example, if I just give you a very concrete example like mathematics, right? There was no clear pattern, right? So if you look at it, like 2021 was a year with so-called peak difficulty, right? You look at it as, for example, questions like the Helen and Ivan questions. There was a whole big hoo-ha in the media, right, about students crying in the exams. But 2022, 2023 was not that bad, right? But 2024, it felt a bit harder compared to 2022 and 2023. So if you just use that as an example, there's no clear pattern, right? It's not like it's alternating, right? So some parents, you like to think that it could be alternating. So this year is hard, this year is easy. But just using that as an example, you can see it's not really like that, right? And so that's one thing just to highlight as well. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So going on. Okay. The next part here. Um. Okay, we will go on to the next portion now, which is in relation to the PSLE preparations and the timelines. Okay. Okay, there's a few more questions. So maybe perhaps what I will do is I will take a couple more for the last section before I go to this one here, right? Just to wrap up on that segment with regards to the posting. I think some of you asked about DSA and also the pros and cons between IP schools and other schools, right? So just to highlight, so this webinar itself is more, I would say, a more comprehensive webinar focusing across, right? So posting, PSLE prep and all. We will have subsequently more targeted webinars focusing on like secondary school selections and DSA as well, right? So that is where we will talk actually about, DSA talent domains. And to the parents' question or students' question on can you be given two different DSA offers, it is possible, right? And that will be ideal lah. So essentially the choice is in your hand. So the DSA discussion itself is something that we'll do as part of a separate webinar itself. Okay. As to another question, so is there a pros and cons between the IP route and the secondary O-level route? I'll give a quick one here. For that one itself, I think it's very much a function of the student. So again, we'll have separate webinars touching more on that. But one thing that you have to take note is the key difference for IP students, and Moses himself is also was an IP student in the past, so he can share a bit of his perspectives later on as well. But you get to bypass the Sec 4 O-level examinations, and because there's also less of a focus in terms of the milestone examination prep, there's going to be a lot more bandwidth for you to pursue other interest areas and explore other, more deeply into other places. For example, in terms of even philosophy, in terms of project work, in terms of other academic domains. So that's the good part. But the problem with that is that it's very much a function of the discipline of the student themselves, right? And even amongst my peers, because previously I was from Raffles, right? And there was an integrated program there as well, right? So I was the last batch that wasn't in integrated program. So my juniors were there. But but based on that experience, you can see that actually it's a function of how well you do from that program. Is actually a matter of your own discipline and accountability. And in fact, there are also some students who say, they really thrive within the system because they really made the best use of IP and all the resources and everything. But there are also students who kind of like, treat it as a time where they can slack off in terms of not building a good foundation and, letting certain things go, right, in terms of catching up on their studies. And you can see that the problem with that is when they then go into junior college, they find it hard to catch up, right, to the A levels. And the reality is they do have to take the A level exams in 2 years' time after that. But because they didn't really build a good foundation from secondary, they realized they couldn't really cope at the A levels. And in fact, some of them, they encountered this nightmare scenario where they have to stay back in JC1 because they can't really pass the exams. So I would say that you can look at it as two different extreme scenarios, right? IP has its merits, but how you use it will be really dependent on also the motivation and the discipline of the students yourself. And that's definitely something that you have to consider. Okay, yeah. And okay, another question, which is from Andrea. So maybe this one I'll just also just type in the chat as well. So I'll put it here in the chat for everybody so you all can see that. Um, this is a good question, right? Let me just put it here for everybody to see. Okay, let me just copy and paste it out. Okay, so if my AL score was 22 according to the table, the posting group is 2 or 3. Can I choose 3 or I don't get to choose? So that's a very good question. You can see here, right? So I didn't touch on that in too much detail because, again, there are other webinars where we do this in more in depth. But you can see what happens here is why is there this 2 or 3? The idea behind that is usually if you look at AL score of 21 and 22, we kind of see that the students are on the margins. On the margins, as in, there could be possible that they can still handle materials at the G3 level, right? A more difficult level. Or it may be maybe they need a bit more time, a bit more space to do the work at a slower pace, which means then that they can do the G2. So it could be either way. So what happens here is G2 or G3 means MOE will give you the chance to choose. That means you can either choose to go in via posting group 2 or choose to go in via posting group 3. You can choose, right? So to the student's question, you can choose either one, right? If you go in via 2, that means most of your subjects will be at the G2 level. But if you go in via 3, then most of your subjects will be at the G3 level. So that's how it works. But there's a catch here. And what's the catch? The catch is if you choose one, you cannot change your mind and choose the other one, right? And you cannot mix. That means you see in your school choices, you have 6 choice, right? So everybody at the end of the year, after you take your PSLE, right, you will have 6 choices of schools, right? And those are very precious because you definitely have to utilize them as well as possible. And what you see here is essentially 2 or 3, right? If you choose posting group 2, all the schools that you pick will be on the basis of posting group 2, okay? But if you choose 3, then all the schools that you pick will be on the basis of posting group 3. but it cannot be a mix. So you cannot have some schools that are posting group 2 and some that are posting group 3. So once you have made up your mind on one, it will be all along that same track. Okay, can? Yeah, so that's the way to look at this. Can?